Hi everyone, welcome to the HCRI seminar series. My name is Roisin Reid and I'm a lecturer in Peace and Conflict Studies at HCRI, and it's my honour to chair this talk today. Just a quick note on housekeeping. This event is being recorded and the recording will be available. It'll be circulated via email to those who registered for the event. So you'll get the link to that. It's also be shared via our social media page. So to today's seminar series, we are delighted to be joined by Silke Roth, who's a professor of sociology from the University of Southampton. Her research focuses on questions of solidarity, inclusion, exclusion, and much of it has explored humanitarian organizations and other social movements. It would take far too long to list all of her publications, but I'd like to say a little bit about her book, The Paradoxes of Aid Work, Passionate Professionals, which was published in 2015. It is a landmark study of aid work. The book expertly interrogates the way that aid work perpetuates existing global inequality and highlights the necessity of an intersectional perspective to understand how racial and national hierarchies are reproduced within the sector, also gender hierarchies. It is, in my opinion, essential reading for anyone interested in either undertaking or studying humanitarianism. I think in some ways it was ahead of its time, as it's really only recently that these conversations have made it to the mainstream of the aid sector. So really timely that we have her with us today to talk about it. Professor Roth's work is consistently at the cutting edge of the field of humanitarian studies. And what I love about it is the way that she is always challenging the boundaries drawn around the field by bringing her analysis into conversation with other areas of study. An interest in social justice really animates her work on humanitarianism, and she places power analysis at the center of the research that she does. And notably for me, the thing that's so unique about her work is that she puts people at the heart of the study of humanitarianism, not just organizations, people with multiple, messy and competing motivations, with lives to live and careers to pursue. So I'm really delighted that she's here to join us at HCRI today to talk about humanitarianism and inequalities. She's going to speak for about 40 minutes. You can pop your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll have time for them after she's spoken. Otherwise, I will hand over to Silke.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roisin, for this lovely introduction. It really, really touched me, and I'm delighted to hear what the book means to you. I thought that perhaps I'd say just a tiny little bit about my background and how I came to write this book. Because, so I'm a sociologist, I'm a political sociologist, a sociologist of gender and of social movements. And before I started working on this book, I didn't know anything about humanitarianism. My PhD was about women in the American labor movement, and towards the end of the 1990s, or the end of the millennium, social movement studies was constantly focusing on NGOs and never looking at the people working in NGOs. I was very good friends with an aid worker, and I just found it really strange that sociology had overlooked humanitarians, because I thought, if we take a sociology of globalization seriously, why look just at social movements and migration? Why not look at humanitarianism and development? And because I always use or not always, but in most of my research, I'm using life history interviews or biographical interviews previously in order to understand how does one become an activist, how does one stay an activist. And I thought that is also a very useful approach for understanding how does one become a humanitarian, how does one stay a humanitarian, and perhaps what comes afterwards. So I think that this life history perspective is always quite useful. But so since I didn't know anything about humanitarianism and development, I had to read a lot and learn a lot and think a lot. And it took me quite a while until I finished and published this book. So I started thinking about it in 2003. I did the first interviews in 2004. So I collected data between 2004 and 2013, over 10 years. And the book was published in 2015. So that means I'm slow, but being slow also helped me to think these issues through, because it was tremendously difficult to write this book, because humanitarians mean well, they want to do good, they want to make a difference. And at the same time, seeing that hierarchies and inequalities are reproduced in aid organizations is uncomfortable to write, but it was important to say it. So it was really difficult to find the right words to explain what's going on, be respectful of each and everyone I interviewed, and at the same time pointing out how global inequalities are reproduced within the aid system. And getting the book published wasn't that easy either. Yeah, so because it goes a bit against the grain, and people asked me, have you worked in aid? And I said, no, I didn't. But I mean, the thing is, like, as a sociologist, you cannot work in every profession, in every organization that you are studying. That is why you do social research. Yeah, that's why one gathers data and analyzes it. So I've come to this as an outsider, not as an insider, but using methods that allow me to understand it, I hope, from an insider's perspective. So I would like to say that before. So first, I approached NGOs as workplaces. I was interested in the careers of aid workers, yeah, also to understand to what extent they perceive their work as political, yeah, or not, and who would perceive it as political or not. And perhaps at the end of the talk, I tell you a little bit about what I'm up to at the moment. But let's get started with the talk. And if we can have the next slide, please. That gives you an overview what I'm going to do in the next 40 minutes. just the structure, and when I'm talking too long, then just interrupt me, because I really want to have a time for a discussion and want to hear what you're interested in, what your questions are. But so if we go to the next slide, I will just say a little bit about humanitarianism in a historical perspective. And I think it's just important that we keep in mind that colonization processes and humanitarianism are deeply intertwined. They are inseparable. Yeah, and so that means also that these conquering and discoveries of new regions from a Eurocentric perspective, yeah, that is also the starting point for humanitarian interventions, yeah, including slavery, including the scramble for Africa, including the dissemination of languages and of religions and of diseases. Yeah, so not just medical aid, but also diseases. That's very important. And when we think about the abolition of slavery, one of the first humanitarian movements, then we also have to keep in mind that who was reimbursed were the slaveholders. They were receiving reparations because they lost their property. Yeah, no reparations for the slaves or the descendants of slaves. And obviously, the colonialism, it underpins racialized capitalism, and we experience this racialized capitalism today when we talk about Black Lives Matter, which now has also reached 8 organizations when we ask about racism or racialization within 8 organizations. And just a few days ago, there was an article in The Guardian about Amnesty International. It's a human rights organization, it's not a humanitarian organization, but we see that these continuities, yeah. So if we go then to the next slide and we jump to the present and the contemporary challenges, then we see very neatly these patterns that started several hundred years ago and created high income and lower income countries. And who is the vaccination available first? Surprise, surprise, in the global north. Where will countries have to wait? Absolutely no surprise, the global south. And again, when we hear what is going on in India in the moment, it is horrific. It's absolutely mind-boggling to see what India currently experiences in these high rates of COVID. And if we go to the next slide and we look at some research that MSF has done about which countries are in favor of waiving the monopolies for COVID medical tools. The global south, the lower income countries, they are in favor of waiving it. Not so Europe and North America. Yeah, so, and I mean, if this is the backdrop for humanitarianism, this is really appalling. Yeah, so we have very, very strong continuities that affect the current situation. Now, when we think about the contemporary challenges, obviously it is the distribution of vaccination, medical care that is available. And obviously that not only applies to COVID-19, that we had, it also applies to the AIDS crisis, to Ebola and so on. But COVID is something that is experienced in Europe, in North America, and so it receives much more attention. Now, obviously, it also affects the way how aid organizations operate. And in the current situation where it is much more difficult to travel, that then can intersect with the push for localization. And that is, of course, not only affected by the pandemic, but also by cuts to aid budgets, by concerns about the security of aid workers, international aid workers, international northern aid workers, and so in that regard, there are multiple intersecting developments going on at the moment. So this as a broad context, and I'm now going to the first of the 3 points that I'm going to discuss when we go to the next slide. And that would be the intersectional perspectives on humanitarianism. And so initially, I think I said I would talk about gender, and I'm going to talk a little bit about gender. I actually have written a book chapter, When Gender is Not Enough, Intersectional Perspectives on Hierarchies in Aid Organizations. But right now the book is stuck. So I hope that it's going to be published soon, but at the moment it is an existing manuscript, which hopefully is going to be available in print in the not too distant future. So the point that I'm making in this article is that we have to look at aid organizations both at gendered organizations, so with a gendered division of labor, with gendered hierarchies, but at the same time also at racially stratified organizations. And that really matters with respect to the international and the local staff, and international and local staff are so problematic categories. Yeah, we should only use them with quotation marks. Yeah. Because we have to keep in mind that although a lot of the publications on aid workers are on white northern aid workers, yeah, but everybody who is not working in their own country is an expatriate, yeah. So somebody from Uganda who's working in Kenya is an expatriate, yeah. The literature has so much focused on the global north, and there is so much work to be done. And I hope that you in the audience who are writing master's theses and dissertations, or are otherwise involved in research, will look at this, yeah, because it's really needed. And at the same time, to really interrogate what we mean by local, yeah, because locals are not necessarily local. They might be from another region of the country, which completely differs in terms of language, culture. And we have to consider, and that I haven't added this on the slide, but I want to emphasize it very, very strongly, that we also need to look at class differences and overall keep in mind to what extent humanitarianism is a very middle class endeavor, yeah, and not necessarily only in the global north, but also in the global south, yeah, so that we really look at these different forms of inequalities and how they inform one another. And that means in terms of who is taking on what kind of leadership positions. And so when we, and here with respect to gender, we can say aid organizations are to some extent similar to other third sector organizations, in which women have more chances to end up in leadership positions than in other sectors. Yeah, so gender is not necessarily, there can be even gender equality. When we look at the UN, there have been a lot of efforts in recent years to do more about gender balance. That doesn't mean that it is entirely reached, but that there are some mechanisms to promote women. But then to look, what is the relationship between white expatriate women and male local staff? Yeah, so you have different kinds of inequalities which are intersecting. And as I said, class plays a role as well, which then also becomes very relevant in terms of training, languages, all kinds of skills that one can obtain. And that, of course, these inequalities then also shape security, and to what extent aid organizations provide security or are concerned about the risks that both international staff and so-called local staff experience. And we could, of course, add to that dimensions about sexual harassment. Yeah, so so it's not just the kidnapping and killing, but it is also the risk of abuse and harassment within aid organizations. And Roshan has recently added this brilliant issue that addresses all these questions. So have a look at that. So if we then move on from these to the next slide, we can build up on this relationship between international and national staff, and look at the role of language. And what I want to emphasize here is the high currency of English. English as capital, symbolic capital and linguistic capital. By emphasizing the high value and currency of English, I'm not saying that aid workers or people working in aid are not required to learn other languages. Absolutely not. Yeah, learning and knowing other languages, in particular other colonial languages, because English is obviously not the only colonial language. French and Spanish are as well, or Portuguese. So obviously it is very useful to speak multiple languages. What I'm arguing, and I have developed that in this article that came out a couple of years ago, is who is speaking what language matters. Yeah, so, and there are also, I mean, the majority of English speakers are, for them, like for me, it's a second language. Yeah, so native English speakers are the minority now. Yeah, because of the success of English as a global language. And the question is how long that will last. Yeah, perhaps in some years, Chinese is taking over. But at the moment, the top spot is English. So what consequences does that have? On the one hand, for the monolingual speakers, yeah, who can rely on the fact that there are colleagues, national or international colleagues, who can translate for them. Yeah, so that means that on the one hand, being a monolingual English speaker is a dominant position because one doesn't speak with a funny accent or doesn't know the right word or does something other stupid and embarrassing. But at the same time, also not doing what people talk about when they speak in another language, which can make someone insecure. Yeah, what are they talking about me? Are they making jokes? But what is involved? So, and for the for the bi or multilingual speaker, English can provide the access to a position. Yeah, somebody who might be trained as a lawyer, as a teacher, as an engineer, speaks English and the local language, might start as a driver or a translator. Yeah, so English becomes more important than other skills in order to make it into an aid organization and then move up, but facing a glass ceiling. Yeah, that's the problem. Now, the English speakers who come as expats then are involved in capacity building, even if they might not be able to speak the language that is necessary in order to do the capacity building. Yeah, but this not knowing the language isn't a problem. Yeah, whereas the language skills of the translators, yeah, becomes naturalized or othered or invisible. Yeah, so so in that regard, I think it's very interesting to think through language. Yeah, and again, my call to you who speak languages other than English, how does French work? How does Spanish work? How does Arabic work? Kiswahili and so on? Because my own limitations are that I could do the interviews only in English and German. Yeah. So, I mean, I interviewed French speakers, but we used English in order to conduct the interview. So I'm limited as well. But I think it's helpful to reflect on the role of languages, or in English in particular, in these encounters. And yeah, I think I said enough about that, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A. So if we then move on to the next slide, that concerns digital humanitarianism. So after the book was in print, I became more and more aware of this digital humanitarianism. It's the solution. Yeah. So just like every some years, a new buzzword comes along and a new technocratic solution, now digital humanitarianism. And I thought, oh, well, have a look at that. Because yes, we are talking about a digital divide. One is talking also about digital inequality. And the interesting thing is then again, how do the existing inequalities, the global inequalities, the inequalities embedded in the aid system, how do they intersect with digital inequalities? And to what extent is then the digital humanitarianism, which should address inequalities and improve people's life, inadvertently reinforcing inequalities and create further problems. So when we look at statistics on internet use, again, it's a very similar pattern as I showed you before with respect to COVID-19. We have regions in the world with very high access to the internet, and on the other hand, lower. And when we look at the digital divide, then within countries, there is also the question to what extent there is a gender divide. And so when we look at lower income countries, the gender divide with respect to the access to digital technologies is larger than in the high income countries. So we can also think about how digital humanitarianism intersects with the language issues that I have discussed before. Then when we think about international aid organizations using digital communication for reporting, for example, yeah, in what programs are used, what languages are used in these programs, and what barriers does that create for local staff? Yeah, so that would be another layer that one could look at. But if you go to the next slide, there are two examples that I just want to highlight, because digital humanitarianism, one starting point is the 2010 Haiti earthquake, where text messages informed about the location of people in need. It was digital humanitarians translated text messages from Creole or from French into English, and here we have the language issue again, but then there were not enough resources to translate it back into Creole or French. And what Markus Luszczak-Roche and I looked at was to what extent different stages of producing, collecting, analyzing data excludes local populations or the beneficiaries or whatever terms we want to use more and more, so that it is most inclusive at the stage when data are produced. But when we look at who has access to these data and how they are analyzed and what decisions are made based on these data, then it is that there is a risk that the people who have access to technology do not have access to knowledge about the local situation, and that informs programs which are not necessarily the most useful for those who would benefit. Yeah, and when we, on the other hand, think about the class differences that I mentioned before, when we look within a crisis situation, who are the people who have access to phones or tablets or computers or any form of digital communication? Are these the ones who are most in need, or do we have within communities then greater inequalities and blind spots, black holes? How do we deal with the fact that people share phones? Yeah, and so in that regard, might not want to share information because they want to not share it with the other person they share the phone with. Or it might become difficult to map the movement of people because you can map the movement of the phone, but not of the person if the phone is shared between different people. So that is one thing. The other thing is, and Sandvik has written about humanitarian variables and for example, Cushy Baby, a necklace that can be worn by mothers or also by children to disseminate information. So how ethical is that? Yeah, so the beneficiaries become data subjects, yeah, without knowing that they are sharing these data. And that raises just very, very complex and difficult questions about who benefits, yeah, from interventions like that. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, yeah. So I already spoke a little bit about this. So when we think about text messages and social media, again, we have the language issues that I talked about before. We have also the exclusion of those who don't have access to digital technology and with consequences. And as I said before, tracking devices can result in a datafication of beneficiaries, and thus one could call that data theft. Another thing is also the widespread use of Facebook can replace indigenous platforms that are better, that serve communication needs better when people would like to stay anonymous, because that is more difficult, if not impossible, with Facebook. And then when we think about these practices, then again, the question is who has access to devices, but not only to devices, but also to data, and what consequences does that have? So very, very big and complex questions. So if we move on now to the next one, the future of humanitarianism. So 5 years ago at the World Humanitarian Summit, localization became very, very central. And localization very much with respect to a transfer of, I think power would be too big a word, more, perhaps better, more involvement in decision making of local actors. And in this sense, local organizations, local governments, a shift of resources also, and with other buzzwords or interventions before, the question is how much has actually changed, and it looks as if the changes have been limited so far. As I said earlier, COVID-19, which makes it harder for international staff to travel, might be an opportunity to push that further, but the question is still, to what extent is outsourcing happening? To what extent is it the headquarters in London, in New York and Geneva who set the tone? So there are very important debates. And I mean, what I would like to bring in as well is, again, the question of the relationship between national staff and international staff within aid organizations. And we know that it is the national staff, they represent the vast majority of people working in aid, about 90% or so. So that it would be really important to keep their role in mind. So the other point that I have here on the slide is a book that was published last year. It doesn't explicitly address humanitarianism or development. It focuses on social activism in communities, not only in the United States, but predominantly in the United States. But I think that even if this book doesn't address explicitly humanitarianism, it would be so useful to engage with, because it really develops how digital humanitarianism can be done right if one includes those who are the beneficiaries in the design development. Yeah, so that only if we include those who are the intended beneficiaries will design justice really be achieved. So therefore, I highly recommend this book. It's open access. It can be downloaded for free from MIT Press, which I think makes it even more attractive. And if you read the first chapter, I hope you find it as exciting as I find it. And that, I think, would be very useful to think about the future of humanitarianism. So if we then go to the next slide, so that means I'm coming towards the end, and I just want to highlight a few of the main points of this talk. To emphasize the continuities between colonial histories of development. And perhaps that is another comment that I should have made in the beginning. And so I just make it at the end. I think in the literatures, it sounds as if development studies and humanitarian studies would be separate strands, but there is so much overlap, and it's often not defined whether we are talking. So one talks about humanitarianism and means development and the other way around. Development studies has engaged longer with racial inequalities than humanitarian studies. And I think it would be quite useful to draw on that rather than to reinvent the wheel and see what are the similarities, what are the differences. But the emphasis that I want to make here, or the point that I want to make here, is that we have to look at these historical continuities, and only if the structural underpinnings are addressed will there be really change. Otherwise, it will remain at the surface, and we will have a new innovation every 5 to 10 years, but structurally nothing will change. I think what is happening now more and more is that race becomes visible in development and humanitarian discourse, and that's perhaps it's ironic that it takes so long for it to become visible, but it needs to be addressed, and that means also that when we talk about expatriate, local, and expertise, these are racialized constructions, and we have to unpack them, what we mean. And I have tried to explain that a little bit with respect to language and to what extent it is naturalized or invisible. Yeah, so that the lack of speaking the beneficiary language is not a problem. And what that means. And so I'm delighted that there is now a growing literature on localization, because in recent years I was always hearing about localization, but I couldn't really find much written about it. And that has now changed, which I think is fantastic. And there, and more empirical research on localization processes are needed. And then finally, I think it would be really useful to draw on notions of design justice in order to develop useful interventions. And so on the next slide, I have listed a list of publications, some of mine that I have talked about, but more important, some books that I find extremely useful, and I wanted to add more, but I wanted to then keep it to one slide. And for example, Swidler and Watkins' book on AIDS altruism, I think, is so useful because it looks at different groups of national staff and how they broker between different levels of aid. So even if this is focusing on Malawi and AIDS, this is useful in so many other contexts. And yeah, I hope you find these readings useful. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. And in terms of what I'm working now on, I'm on the one hand, I'm working on a book that is looking at change organizations, and that brings together literature on social movements, on humanitarianism, on third sector organization, because these are different literatures, and I think they all speak to one another. And I work on this book with Claire Saunders, who's at Exeter University. And I do empirical research, although that has been interrupted by COVID, on the transition from the military to humanitarianism, because I'm interested what pathways there are from, or differences, similarities between being a soldier and being a humanitarian. And that's it.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I have a lot of notes and a lot of questions. And just to remind everyone, if you would like to put your own questions, I see we already have one in the chat, so feel free to add your questions in the chat, or you can use the Q&A function, and they'll come to me first, and I can put them to Silke. I'll start with I'll maybe ask the question that's already in the chat and sneak in one of my own as well. So from the chat, the question is, with the digital inequality in Africa, the cost of data for mobile phones, for many people in the North don't realize that it's extremely expensive and inaccessible to people, especially when videos and graphics are included, which can then further exclude people. With COVID and everything that's moving online, may have saved money for people in the global North, but how does this kind of create further and bigger barriers and inaccessibility and inequality? So the question is, how should we help to address this, in your opinion? And I would throw in an additional kind of element to that question, which is about the precarity, actually. I think the examples of Uganda around the election, Kashmir, show us how easy it can be to turn the internet off, to block people's access to information as well. And actually, I think that's a part of that conversation that needs to be had as well. So I'll throw my own question in with that one to kick us off. If anyone else has questions, please add them to the chat, and I'll let you take that one first.
Yeah, so I mean, the point about the data is such an important point, because I think that is not really reflected by those who are not familiar with the local context. Some years ago, I did a little pilot study in South Africa about the use of information and communication technologies for the prevention and treatment of HIV and AIDS. And what the focus groups revealed was simply that the data was a problem, and people would pay as you go cards and then renew them. And if that is the case and the phone numbers change, then there is absolutely no continuity. And the point is then also that if it is too expensive, then people will not make use of it. So obviously that means that anybody who is developing interventions like that needs to know what people find useful to access, and then come up with ideas of, for example, creating hotspots where people have access to data and combine that with making information available. Yeah, that would be a solution that would address that. And the point about closing down the internet, yes, absolutely. It's a form of repression, and that and then that means that this significantly hampers the provision of services. Yeah, absolutely. So there is a danger, yeah, and I mean that is the other thing that also in the context of all the populist movements around the world, that the initial euphoria about the internet providing bringing democracy about and more citizenship participation, that now really has been rethought. Yes. Yeah.
I have another question from the Q&A. Someone says, very interesting and eye-opening talk. Would you say that social inequalities impact on humanitarian responses, or that humanitarian responses create or exacerbate social inequalities?
I think the diplomatic and probably also the right answer is it depends, and that one really has to be very careful and look at each and every intervention, and also, I mean, the thing is like how I think what is really important is to be fully aware of the inequality that exists prior to the intervention, and what consequences the intervention has. And then to ask, if the ideal cannot be accomplished, how close does one get to the ideal? And I think that is something that has to be asked on a case-by-case basis. And there will never be an answer to it. And I think what aid workers and aid organizations and everybody involved in this have to ask themselves is, one has to check one's privilege, yeah, and see where one is advantaged oneself, where one can share, and there, I don't think there is an easy or simple solution to that.
I'm going to group a couple of questions. So we have one from Jess asking, how did you even begin to narrow down the population you wanted to speak to for your research? Did you focus on a specific aid agency, a specific country, class, gender, and so on? And just picking up on the discussion of class, I'm going to jump and group that together with Bertrand's question, which is, could you comment on the class dynamics arising from the work in the humanitarian systems? For instance, when national staff become expats, is humanitarian work occasionally a social disruptor and or a way to get into the middle class? Does it offer gateways into cosmopolitan class structures?
Okay, so I'm taking these separate these questions. So the first, in terms of how did I select the sample? I wanted to have a really wide, diverse group of people. And representing different types of organizations, different nationalities, experiences, and so on. Because, so I mean, there is wonderful research on MSF, a lot of publications on MSF, absolutely fascinating and great. But MSF is one organization and perhaps not the most typical organization. So, so I was interested to include different experiences, and through the retrospective life history interviews, I also then could learn something about people's trajectories, yeah, who had, for example, started out as local staff, as a driver, and then worked as national staff, as a program officer, and then moved into an international position, for example. Or so people who move between UN and NGOs, or only stayed within the UN, or only within NGOs. So my sample is definitely not representative. I carried out most of the interviews in the context of humanitarian studies courses. And so that means that people were not in the field, yeah, but they were engaging with the field theoretically because they were talking about it. And many of the, so because jobs in humanitarianism, many of them tend to be fixed term, yeah, so people then had to look for another job. I mean, some people stay in the same organization for a long time, but many jobs are fixed term. So doing a master's degree in between, or a diploma, was an opportunity to, on the one hand, be in the field, but at the same time also withdraw from it, reflect on it, gain an additional qualification, but also working on networks. Yeah, so it was kind of like an in and out. My interviews would probably have been different if I would have gone to the field. Yeah, for me, the humanitarian studies courses were the field. Yeah, but to go to the field where humanitarians work, I didn't do that for a variety of reasons. One, I didn't have funding, so I did this all unfunded or with very minimal funding, and that was something how I could afford doing it. But I also wouldn't have wanted to be in people's way. Yeah, so and would have found it unethical. I also doing a study on one particular site would have told me something about this site. And there are many wonderful studies about particular sites, particular organizations. So I thought, brilliant, other people have done this research. I learn from them, I cite them. I don't have to do the same as they do. So, so there were pragmatic reasons and theoretical reasons for doing so. So about the class dynamics, I think that is a fabulous question and such an important one. And I think that yes, so a number of people that I interviewed were in quite a privileged position, yeah, national staff who then became international staff later on. Very privileged in terms of their class background, and that means the access to education that they had. And then depending on where they went, with good opportunities within the UN system. Yeah. But on the other hand, also, so some had good opportunities for careers within the aid system. Others were stuck, and they were stuck because they were locally hired. Yeah, and because they felt they were stuck as national staff member, they felt they had to go to work internationally in order to have an opportunity. And so whenever I read about the brain drain, yeah, then I always ask myself, if there would be more opportunities to move up as national staff member, yeah, perhaps there would be less of a brain drain. Yeah, but I was told both from the side of national staff as well as from international staff that they felt that national staff members were more qualified and experienced, but they were stuck by the international staff was flown in, and there was a turnover, very frustrating for national staff who have to train their bosses every a couple of years. Yeah. And so that then is the question, to what extent, I mean, if localization kicks in, you remember I published this book before the World Humanitarian Summit and these affirmations of localization. If localization kicks in, and it does not only address shifting budgets to local organizations, but also to shift responsibilities to national staff, there might be something different. But I think that on the other hand, we will always see that people will pursue careers regardless of their national origin, and then become part of a cosmopolitan middle class or upper class. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, it's great, thank you. Yeah, I have a follow-up in a minute that on that kind of issue, but first I want to bring in some more questions from the chat. So Larissa says she was struck by your comments around language. You refer to digital inequalities, particularly in terms of inequalities of access that exist. Yet within the aid sector, those who work on digital inequalities usually speak about digital inclusion instead of digital exclusion. What might be the implications of this language for how we address these inequalities? Do similar discrepancies exist with regard to terminologies of inequality? And I suppose I had a question on language as well, which I'll throw in at the same time, which is, it struck me that there's an interesting parallel with academia around languages and the devaluing of area studies. So languages in academia are no longer as kind of prized, I think, as maybe they were at one point, particularly in line with this kind of devaluing of area studies. And I wonder about this, the need to move to progress that you were talking about in answer to your last question, that need to kind of change location in order to move within your career, and how that dynamic plays into the language dynamic and prevents people from kind of developing a long-standing commitment and language knowledge of a particular location.
Okay, great questions. Hello, Larissa. It's great to see you here. So the digital inclusion, yes, I mean, very important to think about how one can include people, and I don't want to minimize that at all. Within sociology and science and technology studies, the focus has been on digital inequalities in order to assess who is included and how, or to what mechanisms might exclude people as an analytical strategy in order to understand to what extent efforts of digital inclusion actually achieve that. So I think that the aim definitely should be to include, yeah, absolutely. I mean, but the point is to be aware to what extent, despite the best intention, what is resulting is that only certain groups are included and others remain excluded. And that is at different stages. So when we, for example, think about many people have cell phones or smartphones or whatever, but the question is still, can they use all the features that these devices offer, and where are the limitations, just as we had it in the earlier question about data, or I mean, at the moment where many of us are teaching online and studying online, we run into problems in terms of the strength of the internet here, yeah, but so I'm not arguing against digital inclusion. I just want to raise awareness where the barriers are and to what extent one is addressing them. And for example, then producing content that is not requiring a lot of data. So for example, recording this as a video, this talk, will require more data than making a podcast. So just to think about what is the best solution for which context. The other question about the strategy of learning languages. Yes, I think that's a very valuable point, and it is it can be and yes, okay. So what people told me in the interviews was to what extent they made strategic decisions about learning English if they spoke French or Portuguese or Arabic or other languages. So and so in that and it is at the moment it has a very high value. I think we just need to think at the same time, what are the losses? And that concerns our universities, the losses of the area studies programs closing down, in terms of the ways of thinking that knowledge of another language brings. Yeah, it brings other sensibilities, it brings vulnerabilities. There are certain things that cannot be expressed in every language. And so I think that, and at the same time, by having a very mobile class of people coming from all different countries, all speaking English, that doesn't mean that the local languages disappear. They will still remain, and translation will still happen. So I think I'm not saying that people shouldn't learn English. Of course they should, but I want us to reflect more on the consequences of functioning in one language and to denaturalize, yeah, rather than othering, yeah, the other languages, yeah, see what value they have. That's what I want. So I mean, the thing is, like, in a lot of respects, I don't have solutions, but I want to raise awareness of these issues.
Thank you. I'll turn to the chat again. We have a question from Magella. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Apologies if I'm not. Who says, have you done any work on the inclusion field, which seems to focus primarily on racial and gender inclusion only and neglects the deaf and or disabled communities? The inequalities and oppression of able and hearing people is also huge and links with your linguistic inequality concept. How do you think this could be addressed, as it is a huge cohort that's being neglected in inclusion conversations and projects, and it is an uncomfortable conversation also for those that are helping, who often have no sign language or disability experience?
It's a brilliant point. I haven't personally done work on this. My last publication, which should be coming out soon, is on intersectionality and social movements. And in that article, I survey all kinds of social movements, women's movements, civil rights movements, environmental movements, what have you, and argue that we need to look at them from an intersectional perspective in every case, because all these inequalities matter, and that, as you rightly point out, that is, of course, not only race, class, and gender, it's also sexuality and age, and as you say, issues about being able, or issues about hearing difficulties, and absolutely, that is it's crucial to address this. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If there are more questions, please do put them in the chat. I have another one for the meantime, which is about your new book. So you mentioned you're working on change organizations, and my question is, I guess, deliberately a little bit contrary, but I wonder to what extent humanitarian organizations are change organizations. How much do they actually seek any kind of transformation? And how much are they involved in that broader project of kind of ensuring the status quo?
Yeah. Well, I mean, our idea is that it is really important to widen the perspective of what social movements do, and that often when we think about social movements, is protest or advocacy, and what we are arguing is that service provision is also important, and service provision does make a difference. Yeah. So when we, for example, think about the work of immigrant organizations that offer, for example, language courses, again, coming back to language, or to computer literacy, yeah, that also can be empowering and get people involved in the political process so that they then become politically active. So if we then see how these different activities intersect, yeah, then the service delivery that aid organizations are engaged in might not address the structural inequalities, but if these organizations at the same time are also involved in advocacy work, then that is happening. And I think that that it is really interesting to explore these tensions, because how good is it if somebody is or groups are protesting while not providing any kind of aid, or on the other hand, providing aid without investigating and targeting the underlying inequalities. And when we then can also look at the World Humanitarian Summit as an attempt to address the structural inequalities, the question is then who is pushing, yeah, and to what extent could mechanisms be developed that put more, again, I'm careful with saying power, but put more power, let's say power, into the hand of those who are the targets of aid, in order to evaluate interventions, yeah, I don't know whether that, yeah.
No,
but I think it is very problematic to think about to what extent is aid just stabilizing the status quo, and to what extent it is it's more comfortable to volunteer rather than to be politically active, which creates more tensions and disagreements, and is unpleasant or uncomfortable. But I think these are questions that are also they come up in the humanitarian context, and it's important to engage with them.
I was thinking about what you were saying about your study participants and engaging with them through the course of your field, which is studying humanitarianism. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you see as the role of academics who teach and study humanitarianism in perpetuating or challenging inequalities in the humanitarian field.
Well, I mean, I think that part of it is really to point out the inequalities, the origins of these inequalities, and of course, if there are useful interventions to challenge them, those as well. So, and I mean, that is something that we see in every social field, so I think there are one thing, and I mean, that brings me back to the earlier question. I think it would be very, very interesting to compare more systematically the research that is done in disability studies, in women's studies, in humanitarian studies, development studies, because these are all projects that are also race studies, because these are all political projects. And that means that on the one hand, one looks at the situation, and at the same time, one looks at the organizations which try to address it and might, at the same time, be limited. Yeah, so we have critical studies of fair trade, critical labor studies. Yeah, and so what the academic needs to do is really look at the tensions and the problems and convey that when teaching. Yeah, and encourage then research by students on this, and reflect, and for both as lecturer or as student, reflect on one's own positionality.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It relates to a follow-up that Larissa's just put in the chat about this tension between the role of critique, which is obviously the lifeblood of academia, and the need for kind of actually people to come up with solutions to address these problems, and how we balance that. And I know it's a conversation that we have quite often with our students who sometimes think, well, you're very critical of this practice and these kind of ways of thinking, and this balance between critique and thinking about ways forward, and particularly when it comes to addressing the inequalities of the sector. I think it's important, and you're right, there's a lot to learn from disability studies, from race studies, from gender studies, about how to incorporate the activist project of those areas within the academic study.
That is exactly why I love this book, Design Justice, because it is, on the one hand, it is critical, but on the other hand, it is also so constructive. Yeah, because what the book does is to describe the projects in which design justice projects were developed. How do we teach it? Yeah, so it's at the one hand very analytical, on the other hand it's very hands-on, and I think that is a great model, because then I completely agree that always being critical can be very, very frustrating, to everyone, to the one who's doing the criticizing and the other one who listens to it, because the question is then, and what is the way forward then? And as I said in an earlier response, I think the point is simply that we always have to take one concrete situation and on a case-by-case basis look at who is involved, who is included, what attempts have been made to include people, what are unintended side effects that we didn't anticipate, how can we address them? How can we do that when we put together panels and seminars? Who gets to speak? Who gets to ask the questions? And I think if we do that on an ongoing basis, that might be the way. But then these are then baby steps forward.
We've reached the end of there's no more questions in the chat. I mean, I could keep talking for hours, but I'm very conscious that you've been talking for a very long time. So I'll give it a minute or so to see if anyone has any last burning questions they'd like to put to Silke. And I'll take this opportunity to say thank you very much. Just to flag that we have another research seminar series event next Thursday at the same time, which is a roundtable on the book Humanitarianism and Human Rights, I believe, Jess. If I've got that correct. So it's a roundtable panel discussion. So have a look at the HCRI website or social media, the Eventbrite, which has all the details for that. So I hope some of you that have joined us today can join us also for that. And it just leaves me to say thank you so much. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and it's been delightful kind of hearing more about the process behind the development of the ideas in the book, and actually how you're seeing them now develop further into the future. So thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the great questions, and I enjoyed it very, very much. Thank you.
So okay, thank you both so much. Thank you all for joining, and if you can join us next week, that would be great. We will also send round the recording of the event probably Monday or Tuesday if you'd like to look back over it, see the reference list again. And yeah, have a lovely afternoon. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Should I stay on for a second, Roshan?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can if you want to.
We had that also when we have these Zoom discussions. It's so weird when there's somebody inside.